I have to tell you, the reason I'm smiling up here is that I'm still in shock that I'm actually standing here. Because I was a boarder at this school a long time ago, and I was one of the naughtiest kids around. And Miss Reeves tried to expel me several times. So the fact that I've been invited back to speak to present students is something that still surprises me. I'm going to talk to you today about something that is fairly controversial. It's a topic that tends to divide people because everyone seems to have really strong views on this. People either think surrogacy is a wonderful scientific breakthrough that helps childless couples, infertile couples start a family where otherwise that would be an impossibility. Or they think it is unethical, it is exploitative, it is trafficking of women and children, and it should be criminalised. And so I'm here today to try and see if we can actually come up with an informed, considered position on surrogacy using international human rights law. Whether that set of standards can help us address some of the concerns that surrogacy raises. Can I have a show of hands who knows who's in this photo? As I thought, the majority of you know that this is baby Gammy and his surrogate Goy. What do we know about baby Gammy? We know that a Perth couple used a surrogate in Thailand to start their family, that surrogate bore twins, and that the Australian parents took only the healthy female child, leaving behind in Thailand baby Gammy who has Down syndrome. We also know that the father of baby Gammy had convictions for child sex offences. How do we know all this? We know all this because the media loves surrogacy. It is sensationalised, it is a scandal. They can use words like exploitative, baby factories, going back to the Dark Ages, slavery, etc. And unfortunately, it is the media that informs a lot of our opinions about surrogacy, a lot of our thinking about whether it's right or wrong, whether it should be allowed or banned. And the media doesn't report a lot of the other surrogacy stories. I'm guessing most of you don't know who's in this photo. So let me tell you, this is baby Manji and her dad, Dr. Ikufumu Yamada, from Japan. Now, baby Manji was born to an Indian surrogate, and unfortunately, her intended parents divorced 1 month before she was born. Her intended mother then decided that she wanted nothing to do with this child. She had no biological connection with it, and she didn't want to raise the child of her ex-husband. The father, who is the biological father of baby Manji, said, "Of course I want to raise my daughter." So he went to India when the child was born to bring her back to Japan. And that's when the problems began. Because Japan said, this child has an Indian mother, and only children born to a Japanese mother are entitled to Japanese citizenship. So we are not going to give her a passport, and we're not going to let her come back into Japan. India said, this is a Japanese baby, this isn't an Indian baby. We are not going to give her Indian citizenship or nationality. So baby Manji was stranded in India. And to add insult to injury, her father's visa ran out, and he had to go back to Japan without her. So he got his mother, a woman in her 70s who spoke only Japanese, to go to India to look after baby Manji and to continue the legal battle to bring her back to Japan. And finally, months later, she was able to go to Japan and is being raised there by her family. You probably also don't know who's in this photo. This is the Balaz twins. A German couple went to India, had twins via surrogacy, and the German government said, we don't recognise surrogacy, these are not German children, we are not allowing them to come back into Germany. India said the same as they'd said with baby Manji, these are not Indian children, we're not going to give them nationality or passport, and it was 2 years before these children were able to return to Germany with their parents. To add another country into the equation, there was a Mexican standoff. Both governments said, as a matter of public policy, we are not going to recognise these children as being of our nationality. Now, clearly, nobody was thinking about the children and what was in their best interests in this scenario. And that's why I think we need to look at surrogacy through the perspective of human rights. What are human rights? Well, they are laws encapsulated in international treaties that governments sign on to and agree to be bound by. And in the surrogacy context, there are 3 different parties that we need to be thinking about when we think about human rights. First and foremost, there are the children. They should be at the centre of our attention. Secondly, there are the women who are surrogates. What are their rights in all of this? And finally, there are the intended parents. Do they have any human rights? What are those? Now, international human rights law was drafted decades ago, long before surrogacy was even a possibility. So there is no explicit reference to surrogacy or to reproductive treatment at all. But the principles are general and broad, and we can still get a lot of guidance from looking at these instruments. So let's start with the children. The Convention on the Rights of the Child has been ratified by 194 countries, almost every country in the world. The only 2 that have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child are Somalia. Doesn't really have a functioning government, so a bit tricky for them to ratify international human rights treaties, and the United States. Well, I don't have long enough to tell you all the reasons that the United States gives for not ratifying this treaty, but I think it is a shame and shameful that they do not. So what does this treaty say that could help us understand and address surrogacy? Well, first and foremost, it says, in any decision concerning children, the best interest of the child has to be the primary consideration. Do you think Japan, Germany, India were thinking about the best interests of the child? No. Another core principle of the Convention of the Rights of the Child is that every child has a right to an identity, to a nationality, to have their birth registered, and to know and be cared for by their parents. And those rights were all violated in these situations. Let me tell you a bit about how transnational surrogacy works. And this is one of the more distasteful aspects of transnational surrogacy in my view. An Australian couple want a white baby. They don't want a brown baby. There are all sorts of racial overtones in this. And so they get eggs from Eastern Europe, from Ukraine, from Kyrgyzstan, from Georgia, and they get them shipped halfway around the world. Globalisation like you never imagined. And they get them fertilised and implanted in an Indian surrogate. And then they get their white baby at the end of the day. The one thing we know from adoption is that many children have a strong desire to know their genetic origins, to know their biological roots. And that's why in Australia, any child born of egg donor or sperm donor material can, when they are 18, go and find out about their donor and make contact with them if they so desire, because we register and record all of the people involved. These children, born of eggs that come from Eastern Europe, via a surrogate in India, have no chance of ever finding out their genetic origins, and that is a breach of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Another aspect of the Convention on the Rights of the Child that is often raised in the surrogacy debates is that children should not be sold. The sale of children is a breach of human rights, and that is right. But I think that's a bit of a red herring in the surrogacy debate, because I don't think surrogacy is about the sale of children. For one thing, sale involves I give you money, you give me what I'm paying for. And that's not what happens in surrogacy. Payments are staggered throughout the gestation period. And if, heaven forbid, the child dies in childbirth or is stillborn, the surrogate still gets the full payment. So that tells us that this is not a transaction of buying and selling a child. This is about paying for the services that the surrogate is providing. So taken as a whole, if we look at all these rights in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, I'd suggest that we would not be participating in and facilitating transnational commercial surrogacy. And what I'm going to be coming to shortly is how Australia should be acting and responding differently to surrogacy in order to ensure that these rights violations do not take place. So what about the surrogate? Well, the starting point for that is CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And it says that women have rights of bodily integrity. That is, they get to decide what they do with their body. Nobody else can tell them, you cannot be a surrogate. You cannot carry a child for another person if that's what you want to do. But what we do see in the surrogacy arrangements in developing countries is that criminal elements get involved. And there have unfortunately been cases where women have been essentially put into slavery to carry children for others as surrogates. And we also have questions about, is there really informed consent to surrogacy when there is such wealth disparity between the intended parents from Australia or Germany or Japan and a surrogate from India? But at the same time, research has shown us that many surrogates say, this is my only opportunity to be able to send my kids to school, to buy a house, to actually get myself out of poverty. So don't tell me that I can't be a surrogate. Finally, intended parents. Well, they have no rights, in that there is not a right to have a child. There is no human right to start a family. What there is a right not to be discriminated against. So when India, as it did a couple of years ago, said we are only going to allow married heterosexual couples to access surrogacy, that was a breach of international human rights law, because that was discriminating against gay couples and against unmarried straight couples on the basis of their marital status or their sexual orientation. So intended parents do have a right not to be discriminated against. So if we take all these international human rights laws, what does that mean for Australia? Australia's response to surrogacy at the moment is to criminalise it. In every state and territory in Australia except the Northern Territory, it is a criminal offence to pay anyone to be your surrogate other than reimbursement of their out-of-pocket expenses. And not surprisingly, there are not many women out there who are prepared to carry a child for another person for only their reimbursement of their out-of-pocket expenses. And that shows up in the statistics. In 2010 and 11, there were 16 babies born to surrogacy in Australia. In India, during that same period, there were 364 babies born to Australian couples, one every day. So that tells us that the Australian system is a spectacular failure in terms of regulating surrogacy. Because not only do we criminalise it in Australia, but in New South Wales, in the ACT and in Queensland, they also criminalise going overseas to engage in surrogacy. But there have been absolutely zero prosecutions for engaging in transnational surrogacy, let alone any convictions. Our system is not working. So what's a better approach? What's a human rights approach? A human rights approach says that we have a wonderful health system in Australia. We are a wealthy, developed nation. We have good legal infrastructure and regulations, such as recording who the egg donors are and who the sperm donors are. And we should not be outsourcing our surrogacy to countries far less able than us to look after children and the best interests of the children. So my response, having considered international human rights law, is to say we should actually allow compensated surrogacy in Australia. Not in the laissez-faire approach of the US, where it's all market-driven and the highest price and all of that, but in a regulated, safe way, where we can screen who can engage in surrogacy, so that we don't get convicted child sex offenders getting children through surrogacy. And when we can screen who becomes a surrogate, so that it is not the poorest of the poor women who are only doing this out of desperation because they need the money. And we can set minimum amounts of compensation for surrogacy as well as maximum amounts. And I suggest that that would be a far better response to surrogacy than our current approach, which clearly is not working. I'd like to end with a poem. It's a poem by a Lebanese philosopher, Khalil Gibran, from 1923, long before surrogacy was a possibility. But when I read it, it had a lot of important messages for the surrogacy debate. And what Khalil said was, your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, they do not belong to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls belong in the house of tomorrow. For life goes not backwards, nor tarries with yesterday. And what I take from that is that how a child is conceived, how a child is birthed, in the scheme of things is largely irrelevant. What is important is that we love and respect children, that we respect their inherent dignity, and that we treat them as autonomous individuals and not as property. If we take that philosophical approach to surrogacy, we are likely to come up with a much better legal framework for how to deal with these issues. Unfortunately, the law tends not to be able to keep pace with scientific and medical advancements. Lawyers are often viewed as dinosaurs, and we're very conservative and traditional, and it takes us a long time to change the laws. But there is an urgent need for us to change the surrogacy laws now, because we cannot afford to have any more cases like baby Gammy, baby Manji, or the Balaz twins. Thank you.